California's trucking industry is shrinking fast. Not because demand collapsed. Not because people stopped buying goods. But because a series of state regulations has made it nearly impossible for tens of thousands of independent truckers to continue operating legally. What started as a push for labor protections and environmental reform has triggered a chain reaction. Independent drivers are leaving the state. Freight capacity is tightening. Transportation costs are rising. And those costs are now moving through the supply chain into grocery stores, retail prices, and household budgets. This isn't theoretical. It's already happening. Today we're breaking down how California got here, what policies set this in motion, why truckers say the system is breaking, and who ultimately pays the price when trucks disappear from the road. To understand what's happening now, we need to go back several years. In 2020, California passed a sweeping labor law designed to reclassify independent contractors as employees across multiple industries. The stated goal was to extend workplace protections like benefits, minimum wages, and job security to workers who had long been classified as contractors. At the center of that law was a legal standard used to determine whether someone could remain an independent contractor. One part of the test focused on whether the worker performed tasks outside the core business of the company hiring them. For trucking, this created an immediate problem. If a driver is hauling freight for a logistics company, they are doing exactly what that company exists to do. Under the law's framework, many owner-operators no longer qualified as independent contractors and would need to be treated as employees. The trucking industry challenged the law almost immediately, arguing that it conflicted with federal protections governing interstate commerce. For a period of time, enforcement was paused while the legal challenge played out. During that pause, trucking operations continued largely as they always had. Then the legal shield disappeared. In mid-2022, the legal challenge protecting truckers came to an end. With courts declining to intervene further, California began enforcing the labor law against trucking companies that relied on independent owner-operators. State labor officials made their position clear. Companies would need to reclassify drivers as employees or face penalties. For large corporations with deep pockets, compliance was expensive but manageable. For small and mid-sized carriers, it was financially devastating. Independent truckers typically operate as small businesses. They pay for fuel, insurance, maintenance, and repairs. They choose which jobs to take and when to work. After expenses, many earn a modest but sustainable living. Reclassifying those drivers as employees flips the cost structure entirely. Companies must provide equipment, cover operating costs, pay payroll taxes, offer benefits, and comply with California's labor rules around overtime and breaks. For carriers operating on razor-thin margins, the math simply didn't work. Once enforcement began, truckers faced hard choices. Some were offered employee positions that paid significantly less than what they earned as independent operators. Others were told they would need to sell their trucks or lease them back under restrictive terms. Many chose a different path. They left California. Some moved their operations to other states. Some shifted to routes that avoided California entirely. Others exited trucking altogether. Industry estimates suggest that within months of enforcement beginning, tens of thousands of independent truckers were no longer operating within the state. That loss matters because independent owner operating within the state. That loss matters because independent owner-operators' freight system, especially around ports and agricultural regions. When they disappear, there is no quick replacement. California's economy depends on trucking more than most states. Its ports handle a massive share of imported goods. Its farms produce a significant portion of the nation's fruits and vegetables. Nearly everything moving in or out of the state travels by truck at some point. Independent drivers play a key role in short-haul freight. These are frequent, time-sensitive trips moving containers from ports to warehouses, farms to processing facilities, and distribution centers to retailers. As independent truckers exited the market, available hauling capacity dropped sharply. When capacity drops and demand stays the same, prices rise. Shipping costs increased. Booking delays became common. Loads that used to be picked up within a day now took nearly a week to move. For perishable goods, delays meant spoilage. For manufacturers and retailers, delays meant higher costs. Those higher costs didn't stop at the warehouse. They moved downstream. As transportation expenses increased, businesses had two options: absorb the losses or pass the costs on. Most passed them on. Food distributors paid more to move produce. Retailers paid more to restock shelves. Importers paid more to transport goods inland. Over time, consumers began noticing higher prices on everyday items, not because demand surged, but because moving goods through California became more expensive and less reliable. And the ripple effect didn't stop at the state line. California acts as a gateway for much of the western United States. Disruptions there affect pricing and availability far beyond its borders. One assumption behind the policy was that large trucking companies would step in and fill the gap. That didn't happen. California's labor rules make it costly to base employees in the state. Overtime requirements, workers' compensation costs, and compliance penalties are among the highest in the country. Rather than expand operations, many large carriers adjusted routes to reduce exposure. Freight bound for California was often rerouted through neighboring states, with final delivery handled by out-of-state drivers when possible. The result was a fragmented system with fewer trucks where they were needed most. At the same time, labor rules reshaped the industry. California introduced aggressive environmental mandates for heavy-duty trucks. These rules require a transition to zero-emission vehicles over the coming decade, with stricter timelines for trucks serving ports. Electric heavy-duty trucks cost far more than diesel models. Charging infrastructure remains limited. Financing is difficult, especially for independent operators. For drivers already struggling under labor reclassification, the prospect of investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into new equipment became unrealistic. The combined effect of labor and environmental policies squeezed independent operators from both sides. And to understand why this situation keeps getting worse instead of stabilizing, you have to look at how California's regulatory system actually functions. Once a law like this is passed, no single agency is responsible for the outcome. Labor regulators enforce classification rules. Environmental regulators enforce emission standards. Port authorities manage congestion. Each agency operates independently with its own mandates and incentives. No one is tasked with asking what happens when all of these rules collide simultaneously. That collision is exactly what truckers are experiencing. Enforcement often happens through audits, complaints, and retroactive penalties. Companies can be investigated months or even years after the fact. If violations are found, penalties can reach into the millions. For small carriers, that risk alone is enough to shut down operations. Fear spreads quickly. Drivers sell trucks. Companies stop onboarding operators. Banks tighten lending. Insurance providers raise premiums or exit the market entirely. Financing is a critical but overlooked piece of this crisis. Independent truckers rely on loans to purchase equipment. Once enforcement began, California-based operators were suddenly viewed as high-risk borrowers. Interest rates rose, loan approvals slowed. Some lenders stopped financing California trucking altogether. Without financing, drivers can't buy trucks. Without trucks, freight doesn't move. Insurance followed the same pattern. Premiums rose sharply. Coverage options shrank. Some insurers refused to cover certain operations in California at all. For many drivers, insurance alone became the breaking point. Then there are the ports. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach are national infrastructure. When trucks don't move containers efficiently, ships back up. But unlike the pandemic, this congestion isn't driven by demand surges. It's driven by capacity loss. Independent truckers historically provided flexibility. They handled short-notice loads, worked irregular hours, and absorbed congestion shocks. When they leave, that flexibility disappears. Shipping companies have responded by diverting cargo to ports in other states. Texas, the Gulf Coast, and the East Coast are absorbing volumes that once flowed through California. These shifts increase transit time and cost, but companies prefer predictability over regulatory risk. Once shipping lanes shift, they don't automatically come back. The agricultural impact is even more severe. California's farms rely on precise timing. Crops don't wait. When trucks aren't available, produce spoils. When produce spoils, growers lose revenue. Over time, production declines or shifts elsewhere. This affects food prices nationwide. California supplies a massive share of the country's fruits and vegetables. When transportation becomes unreliable, those costs are embedded into grocery prices everywhere. There's also a demographic reality that rarely gets discussed. Independent trucking has long been a pathway into the middle class, especially for immigrants and first-generation business owners. Buy a truck. Build equity. Support a family. Grow over time. Assembly Bill 5 effectively closed that pathway. Becoming an employee eliminates ownership, control, and long-term upside. Many drivers chose to leave rather than give that up. And when people leave, experience leaves with them. You can't replace tens of thousands of skilled operators overnight. Another consequence is consolidation. As small operators disappear, market share shifts to large firms that can absorb regulatory costs. Competition declines, prices rise. Supply chains become more fragile, not more resilient. This runs directly against the stated goals of stability and protection. The environmental argument also deserves scrutiny. Cleaner trucks are a worthy goal. But forcing a transition without economic viability undermines the outcome. When freight is rerouted hundreds of miles out of state, emissions don't disappear, they move. In some cases, total emissions increase. Warnings were issued years ago. Industry groups warned lawmakers this would happen. Economists warned about capacity loss. Port authorities warned about congestion. These warnings were dismissed. Now those predictions are playing out. And yet there has been no meaningful course correction. State leadership continues to defend the framework. Enforcement continues. Political incentives remain unchanged. Meanwhile, the cost of inaction grows. California is facing budget pressure, infrastructure strain, and rising living costs. Transportation inefficiency feeds all three. At some point, the question stops being ideological and becomes practical. How many truckers have to leave? How high do prices have to rise? How much food has to spoil? Because once supply chains break deeply enough, rebuilding them becomes far harder than breaking them ever was. California's trucking industry isn't just another sector. It's the circulatory system of the economy. When circulation slows, everything weakens. This isn't a future warning. It's the present. The decisions that led here were made years ago. The consequences are arriving now. And unless something changes, the damage will compound. Independent truckers were the first to feel it. Consumers are next. And by the time it becomes impossible to ignore, the trucks that once kept California moving may already be gone. There's another reason this story keeps resurfacing. Even when headlines move on, the trucking system is not something you can pause and then restart later. When drivers sell their rigs, move out of state, or switch careers, the network loses more than vehicles. It loses relationships, local knowledge, and the invisible coordination that keeps freight moving. Dispatchers know which drivers can handle port runs without missing appointments. Shippers know which carriers actually show up on time. That web of trust takes years to build and minutes to break. And the economic logic is brutally simple. Freight markets don't reward good intentions, they reward reliability. If moving a container through California becomes slower, riskier, and more expensive than routing it another way, shippers will adapt. They may not love the detour, but they will choose predictability every time. That's why temporary disruption has a habit of turning into permanent realignment. You can see it in the quiet decisions businesses make when logistics volatility rises. They hold extra inventory. They pick suppliers closer to the end market. They shift warehousing into neighboring states. They sign longer contracts with fewer carriers, which again favors large firms and squeezes out smaller operators. Each step looks rational in isolation. Together, they reduce flexibility and make the system less resilient. The irony is that California's regulations often assume an ideal market with unlimited capital and perfect compliance capacity. Real trucking doesn't look like that. It's a patchwork of independent contractors, small fleets, and regional carriers operating on tight margins, adapting week to week to fuel prices, maintenance shocks, and rate swings. When policy increases fixed costs while also increasing legal risk, it doesn't just raise standards. It changes who can afford to participate. And when participation drops, there's a secondary effect that consumers feel even if they never think about trucks. Service quality declines. Deliveries become less consistent. Appointment windows widen. Retailers compensate by charging more, stocking less variety, and shifting more cost onto consumers through fees, minimums, and surcharges that are really just logistics inflation, the nicer name. This is why the governor's political problem isn't only that truckers are angry, it's that supply chains are measurable. If freight rates rise, if dwell times increase at ports, if retailers report higher distribution costs, those metrics become receipts. You can debate motivations. You can't debate invoices. So the question isn't whether California can regulate trucking. It can. The question is whether it can regulate it in a way that matches infrastructure reality. What equipment is actually available? What charging networks exist? What financing markets will tolerate? And what labor models the industry can sustain without collapsing capacity? If policy ignores those constraints, the outcome won't be cleaner or fairer. It'll be thinner, slower, and more expensive. And for anyone outside California, here's the key takeaway. This isn't contained. The Western supply chain is one system. When a major node becomes unstable, costs and delays propagate outward. You don't have to live in Los Angeles to pay for a bottleneck in Los Angeles. If you buy food, furniture, electronics, or medicine that moves through the West, you're connected whether you like it or not. That's why this matters now. Not as a partisan talking point, but as a warning about how quickly essential systems degrade when policy treats the economy like it's a whiteboard diagram instead of a living network. The trucking industry is sounding the alarm because once the network breaks far enough, rebuilding it takes years, not weeks. And by then, the damage is already priced in.